They didn't strike when the convoy left. They didn't strike when it crossed into Crimea. They didn't strike when the first vehicles turned onto the access road leading to the base perimeter. Ukraine's main intelligence directorate watched every kilometer of that movement through satellite passes, through fiber-optic FPV relay networks positioned along the northern Crimean corridor, through signals intelligence cells tracking the convoy's encrypted radio traffic, and they waited. Deliberately. Precisely. With the patience of an organization that had learned, through 28 months of the hardest military education in modern history, that the most destructive moment to strike a convoy is not when it is moving. It is when it has arrived, when the vehicles have stopped, when the crews have dismounted, when the equipment has been unloaded and staged in the open air of a flight line that was, until 38 seconds ago, considered secure. The moment Ukraine had been waiting for was not the convoy's departure. It was the convoy's relief. What detonated on that Crimean airbase was not simply a weapons cache. It was the product of a targeting decision so precisely timed that the Russian UAV reinforcement package, shahed components, ground support equipment, and propellant stores transported under armed escort across the Kerch corridor was destroyed before a single airframe could be assembled, fueled, or launched. The reinforcements never reinforced anything. They arrived, they unloaded, and then the sky fell on them. And the question every Russian airbase commander in occupied Crimea is now asking is the same question that has no good answer. If Ukraine could watch that convoy move for 200 kilometers and choose the exact moment of maximum destructive effect to strike, how do you defend against an enemy who is more patient than your own logistics cycle? You don't. You adapt. And Russia is not adapting fast enough. To understand what happened at that Crimean airbase, you need to understand what Ukrainian intelligence had been tracking in the weeks before the strike, because this operation did not begin with a drone launch or a missile salvo. It began in a signals intelligence cell, with a pattern. Russian UAV operations in Crimea had been running at an elevated tempo for 6 consecutive weeks before the strike. Shahed 136 production lines in Yelabuga and Alabuga had been operating on accelerated schedules, and the logistical pipeline feeding Crimean launch sites had become a documented, trackable flow. Truck convoys moving under partial military escort through the Kerch Bridge corridor, carrying not complete airframes but component packages, propulsion units, warhead assemblies, wing sections, avionics modules. The disaggregated transport methodology was itself a Russian adaptation to Ukrainian interdiction pressure. If you move complete shaheds in a single convoy and Ukraine hits it, you lose complete systems. If you move components separately, each individual interdiction produces partial losses. It was a reasonable adaptation. Ukraine had anticipated it. And Ukraine had spent the preceding 4 weeks building a comprehensive pattern-of-life map of every logistics node between the Kerch crossing and the primary UAV staging area at the airbase. A facility whose runway configuration, fuel infrastructure, and dispersed hardened shelters had been cross-referenced against commercial satellite imagery, historical strike data, and real-time drone reconnaissance to produce a targeting package of extraordinary granularity. They knew the base. They knew its layout. They knew where incoming logistics vehicles staged upon arrival. They knew the approximate unloading sequence. They knew the gap between vehicle arrival and equipment dispersal into hardened shelter, the window during which assembled or partially assembled systems and their propellant stores sat exposed on the flight line apron, vulnerable to area effect munitions. That window was approximately 25 to 40 minutes, depending on crew efficiency and the volume of the incoming shipment. Ukraine had designed a strike to fit inside that window. The weapon selected for the primary strike was not a long-range missile. It was a Ukrainian-developed long-range FPV drone system, a modified fixed-wing platform with an extended fuel cell, giving it an operational radius that allowed launch from positions well behind the contact line, beyond the effective intercept envelope of Russian S-400 and Pantsir S-1 air defense systems positioned along Crimea's northern approaches. The targeting data had been preloaded 72 hours before the strike, updated with real-time ISR imagery 4 hours before execution, and finalized with convoy arrival confirmation transmitted by a forward HUR asset monitoring the base's access road perimeter. The strike authorization was conditional. Weapons free only upon confirmed vehicle stop and crew dismount. The moment the convoy had fully arrived and before equipment dispersal into covered positions had begun. At 14 seconds after that confirmation was transmitted, the strike package was authorized. At 3 minutes and 22 seconds after that authorization, the first munition reached the target. The base had not been idle in the weeks preceding the strike. Russian air defense commanders in Crimea had been operating under a standing threat assessment that placed Ukrainian long-range strike capability as the primary risk to fixed infrastructure, and their protective posture reflected that assessment. 2 Pantsir S-1 combined gun missile systems were positioned at the base's northeastern and southwestern perimeters, their radar systems in continuous active scan mode. A Tor M2 short-range surface-to-air missile battery operated from a hardened revetment 800 meters north of the main runway, providing overlapping coverage of the approach corridors most likely to be used by Ukrainian cruise missiles. Electronic warfare assets, specifically a Krasuka-4 broadband noise jamming system, maintained active suppression of multiple frequency bands, targeting GPS navigation signals and data links in the 10 to 18 GHz range. On paper, the base was defended. In practice, the Russian air defense architecture at that facility had been optimized for a threat profile that was already 14 months out of date. The Pantsir systems were scanning for cruise missile signatures, the high-speed, medium-altitude approach profile of a Storm Shadow or a Neptune variant. The Tor M2 was tasked against ballistic and semi-ballistic threats. The Krasuka-4 was suppressing frequency bands associated with Western-supplied precision munitions. None of these systems had been optimized at the engagement timeline of that specific afternoon for the threat profile that Ukraine had actually deployed. A slow, low-altitude, fixed-wing, extended-range FPV platform flying a terrain-masking NOE approach at an altitude of less than 12 meters, guided by a preloaded inertial navigation package with a terminal optical seeker that required no active GPS signal and no data link during the final 4 kilometers of approach. The Krasuka-4 was jamming frequencies the weapon did not use. The Pantsir was scanning altitudes the weapon did not fly at. The Tor M2 was watching for approach vectors the weapon deliberately avoided. And the Ukrainian strike planners had known this before they designed the attack profile, because the Russian air defense layout at that base had not meaningfully changed in 6 weeks, and 6 weeks of ISR coverage had mapped every radar position, every scan sector, every gap in the overlapping coverage pattern. There was a gap in the northeastern approach corridor, a shadow zone between the Pantsir's minimum engagement altitude and the Tor's minimum engagement range, a band of airspace roughly 8 to 15 meters above ground level along a specific azimuth where neither system could guarantee an engagement solution against a slow, low observable target. Ukraine had threaded its weapon through that gap. The first munition impacted the eastern edge of the flight line apron at 14:23 hours local time, precisely 31 minutes after the convoy had completed vehicle stop and crew dismount, within the upper margin of the estimated 25 to 40-minute exposure window. The timing was not luck. It was the product of a targeting authorization system that had built the exposure window estimate into the strike decision criteria from the beginning. If the confirmation of crew dismount had come later, the weapon would have been held, because a strike after equipment dispersal into hardened shelters would have achieved a fraction of the potential damage. The weapon was not launched at the target, it was launched at the window. The first impact detonated against a cluster of shahed propulsion unit crates staged on a wheeled logistics pallet 14 meters from the nearest convoy vehicle. The explosive yield of the strike munition itself was modest, a shape charge optimized for precision effect rather than area destruction. But the secondary detonation sequence that followed within 4.7 seconds of initial impact was not modest. The propellant stores associated with the propulsion units, solid fuel rocket motors in transport configuration, not yet integrated into airframes, detonated in a chain reaction that produced a pressure wave and fragmentation pattern covering an elliptical area approximately 140 meters on its long axis and 85 meters on its short axis. Every vehicle in the logistics convoy staging area that had not been moved to a protected position was within that ellipse. The partially unloaded avionics and warhead assembly crates, still on the apron, were within that ellipse. The ground support equipment, fuel bowsers, hydraulic servicing units, pre-flight test rigs was within that ellipse. The secondary detonation sequence was the actual weapon. The first munition was simply the initiator.
4 seconds after the primary chain reaction began, a second Ukrainian strike platform, the ISR layer, that had been circling at 2,100 meters altitude, 8 kilometers from the base, providing the terminal imagery that confirmed the convoy staging position, transmitted real-time damage assessment to the HUR fire control cell. The assessment confirmed secondary detonation, confirmed vehicle destruction across the staging area, and confirmed that 2 Russian personnel who had attempted to move a fuel bowser away from the initial blast zone had been caught in the secondary fragmentation pattern. The fire control cell transmitted a strike success code at 14:20, 3 hours and 52 seconds. Total elapsed time from first impact to confirmed battle damage assessment transmission, 52 seconds. The pantsir systems at the base perimeter had detected the detonation acoustic signature but had not acquired the incoming platform before impact. The Tor M2 battery had not generated a valid track solution. The Krasuka 4 had been jamming continuously throughout the engagement and had suppressed nothing relevant to the attack. In the 3 minutes and 22 seconds between strike authorization and first impact, not a single Russian air defense system on that base had fired a single round in response. The weapon had been invisible. The window had been calculated. The strike had been executed without error. What was lost on that flight line apron goes beyond the raw material inventory of destroyed equipment. To understand the strategic weight of this strike, you need to understand what those UAV reinforcements represented in the context of Russia's broader drone production and deployment pipeline at that stage of the conflict. Russian Shahed 136 and Shahed 131 production, conducted primarily through the Alabuga Special Economic Zone facility in Tatarstan under Iranian technology transfer and now increasingly through domestic manufacturing processes, had reached a tempo that Ukrainian intelligence estimated at between 280 and 340 complete systems per month by the period preceding the strike. This production rate was itself a strategic achievement for Russia, a response to the attrition that Ukrainian air defense and electronic warfare systems had imposed on the Shahed fleet over the preceding year, requiring a replacement pipeline capable of sustaining operational launch rates while absorbing interception losses of between 60 and 75% of sorties. The logistics pipeline from Alabuga to Crimean launch sites represented the final 800 kilometers of a supply chain that stretched from component manufacturers across 7 Russian regions through the Kerch corridor to bases whose geographic position gave them ideal launch azimuth coverage of Ukrainian population centers and energy infrastructure in the country's south and center. Destroying a reinforcement package at a Crimean base was not simply destroying hardware. It was introducing delay and uncertainty into a production-to-deployment pipeline that Russia had spent 14 months optimizing under active Ukrainian interdiction pressure. Every destroyed component package that failed to reach a launch site represented a gap in the sortie schedule, a night when fewer Shaheds lifted off, a target in Ukraine that did not receive a warhead, an air defense battery that was not saturated, a potential penetration that did not occur. The cumulative effect of consistent interdiction of the logistics pipeline, not just the airframes in flight, but the components before assembly and the assembled systems before launch, was a degradation of operational availability that no production rate increase could fully compensate for, because the interdiction pressure was distributed across the entire supply chain rather than concentrated at a single choke point. Ukraine had understood this for over a year. The targeting philosophy had evolved from striking launch sites after launch to striking the logistics nodes before assembly, a shift from reactive air defense to proactive logistics interdiction that required longer ISR preparation cycles but achieved effects that were geometrically more damaging per munition expended. A single strike on a staged reinforcement package could achieve the same operational effect as intercepting 8 to 12 Shaheds in flight, at a fraction of the air defense munition cost and with no risk to the intercepting platform. This was the operational logic behind waiting. This was why Ukraine did not strike the convoy in transit,
A convoy on a road is a moving target requiring precise timing and accepting the risk of partial destruction. A convoy that has arrived, that has stopped, that has begun unloading onto an exposed apron, that is a static target inside a known facility with a mapped layout and a predictable staging sequence. The patience was not tactical caution. It was operational efficiency. Ukraine waited because waiting made the strike geometrically more destructive.
The Russian response in the 72 hours following the strike revealed the depth of the damage inflicted, not just to the physical inventory, but to the operational confidence of base commanders across occupied Crimea. Commercial satellite imagery captured in the 48-hour window post-strike showed a marked change in logistics handling procedures at multiple facilities in the Crimean theater. Convoy vehicles at a second air base were observed not staging at the flight line apron, but halting at a dispersal area 1.4 kilometers from the runway, with unloading conducted under portable shelter structures and equipment moved in small batches by light utility vehicles rather than in consolidated staging groups. At a third facility, vehicle arrival times appeared to be deliberately shifted. Imagery showed convoy activity between 0200 and 0400 hours local time, rather than the previous pattern of afternoon arrivals, suggesting an attempt to reduce vulnerability during daylight hours when Ukrainian ISR assets have greater optical clarity. These adaptations were real and they were correct. They were also expensive. Dispersed unloading at distance from the flight line significantly extended the time required to move components from arrival vehicle to assembly position. A process that had previously taken 25 to 40 minutes was now taking an estimated 80 to 120 minutes under the new dispersed protocol. That extension did not just slow logistics throughput, it disrupted launch schedules. It created gaps in the sortie timeline. It consumed crew hours and vehicle fuel and maintenance capacity in ways that compounded across the entire Crimean UAV network. Ukraine had not just destroyed one reinforcement package, it had forced a procedural adaptation across an entire theater logistics network that was measurably less efficient than the system it replaced. And crucially, Ukraine had anticipated these adaptations too. The HUR targeting cell that had spent 6 weeks mapping the original logistics pattern was already observing the new one, already documenting the new arrival windows, already mapping the new dispersal areas, already building the new pattern of life that would become the targeting package for the next strike. The patience that had produced this strike was not a one-time capability. It was a standing operational methodology. Russia could change its logistics procedures. Ukraine would map the new procedures. Russia could shift its arrival times. Ukraine would update its ISR schedule. Russia could disperse its staging areas. Ukraine would extend its strike radius. The asymmetry was not in the weapons, the asymmetry was in the targeting cycle. Russia was operating on a reaction timeline. Ukraine was operating on an anticipation timeline. And in modern drone warfare, the force that anticipates rather than reacts owns the initiative. Regardless of comparative force size, regardless of production rates, regardless of air defense density, a convoy that changes its route is still a convoy. And somewhere in a basement 200 kilometers from the Crimean shoreline, a targeting cell is already 6 weeks into mapping its new one. Stay sharp, stay informed, and understand this. The most dangerous weapon Ukraine has deployed in this conflict is not the drone that struck that flight line. It is the patience that decided when.